And now we continue with this discussion. As I mentioned earlier on, we will be joined by two journalists. We will speak now to Juliet Nanfuka, a journalist from Uganda who specializes in disinformation. Later on, we will be joined by the president of Kenyan Editors Guild, Zubeidah Kananu. But first, let me welcome Juliet Nanfuka. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start.
And good evening to you too.
Thank you. Good evening. I want to start with Reporters Without Borders and its own gauge according to data and reports of countries that are amongst the worst just in terms of governance and accountability. Nations ranked amongst the lowest include your country, Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Eritrea. As I said, that's according to Reporters Without Borders. From your experience, is this well earned for Uganda? And what have been some of the challenges that would have brought it to this level of ranking?
Okay, so this is the ranking on press freedom.
Yes, on governance and accountability, just in terms of, yes.
Okay, so I think a common theme between those countries is the questionable democratic credentials that they have. One thing that we have found over the years is that the more gaps you have in your democratic credentials, the higher the chances of affronts to freedom of expression will you have. The gaps in transparency and accountability will also emerge. We have emerging fields of disinformation and misinformation at play considerably, and a lot of mudslinging with who is perpetuating those problematic narratives in online spaces. In Uganda, we saw that during the 2021 elections, reports of disinformation documented by Twitter and Facebook, Twitter at the time, and Facebook resulted in the platform removing some of the actors from the online space, from those accounts. And in response, the state blocked social media. That was to be expected, as that has been the practice previously. But what we also saw this time around, at least in 2021, was the complete shutdown of the internet. Again, another very questionable tactic common in countries with poor democratic credentials and accountability and transparency measures. So what we're seeing is an affront to freedom of expression and access to information, an affront to the practice of journalism at critical times, such as elections, at critical times, such as public protest. And so these gaps in information at this point in time reduce the might of the media, reduce the role of the media at a time when information is most needed, information to challenge reporting on election incidents, for example, the challenge to report what's happening, even in opposition, even within, to report on what's happening in opposition actors' fronts, as long as in the ruling party fronts. And we see these actions leading to the low rankings that we're seeing in the reports, such as that produced by Reporters Without Borders. We have the Press Freedom Index, which also shows very similar results, very poor rankings. And again, the usual countries, as you've mentioned, appearing in those spaces, performing poorly as well. So we're seeing a trend that is common, as I mentioned earlier, to countries with very poor democratic credentials, and in some instances, worsening democratic credentials.
And I want to take a look at the legal framework, including the economic context within which journalists operate under. I believe, and as much as there's been shut down by state actors, there's also been a shrinking of investment. And that, I'd imagine, is also attached to a social-cultural context. So if you could just tell us how some of these have led to or even generated, misinformation, disinformation campaigns.
Okay. So we cannot remove the practice of journalism from the practice of economics. So the behaviors of economics. We also cannot remove that from the rule of law or the absence of rule of law. And in the instances where we see states overriding rule of law in their favor, the most obvious outcome, or generally the outcome, is a loss in risk ranking or a loss of reputation. And of course, that has economic impact. We've seen some countries some funders in some of these countries remove their funding or reduce the amount of funding, for example, to various programs because of how press freedom is treated, because of how access to information is treated. So there's an economic impact, not well documented, not always well reported on about. And these are some of the issues that was spoken about at the M20 meeting today. But we cannot um, we cannot remove the fact that the actions of this, like I mentioned earlier, the actions of the state do have some kind of bearing. When we shut down the internet, there's obviously an economic impact to the state, to ordinary individuals. In the case of Uganda, when the internet is shut down, we also have a block to mobile money transactions. This is in a country with a very big informal economy, heavily reliant on mobile money as a tool for transactions, as a tool for making basic payments for water, education, basic services, trade. And so those economic hits that we as a country take or absorb in some manner, but it does not bear well in the greater economy, in the greater scheme of things when we want to look at Uganda relative to the performance of other countries at a similar point in time, which are not having any form of disruption, which are not disrupting the economy within their own societies. So the consequences are generally quite big, not well documented. As an organization, the Collaboration and International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa produced a cost calculator to understand the economic impact of these decisions on society. And they're huge, they're immense. And we are now at a time where we can now add on the gig economy, the creative economy, the content economy in online spaces. So the hit that is taken when states decide to remove information or remove access to information has grown.
Can
And
I
it's
just
something
jump in
that,
there and ask, what have you seen, documented or not, the anti-competitive behavior of tech giants and how they've impacted local media, and even the influence of regional actors in, really boosting the public trust in terms of information resilience?
okay, that's a big question. It's so as a continent, we are still struggling to find a position, a foothold in the broader um, digital landscape when it comes to the tech giants. We we are very aware that as sub-Saharan Africa at least, the value of um, a consumer of digital content will not have the same amount of a value of someone out in a more developed country. And those decisions impact some of the competitive behaviors that we see platforms having. Those decisions also impact just where we rank in some of the legal processes that inform how platforms respond to some of the issues that we raised from the global south. And I'll take the case of Kenya, where a lot of content moderation was being done by actors there, but getting peanuts. Yet the impact of their work had far-reaching consequences for a broader economy, for the bottom line of many of these platforms. But that dynamic is something that has often gone and not well appreciated, but has been present. It now plays out in different ways. to date still. For example, a content creator in, say, Djibouti will not be ranked at the same level as a content creator in the US. But nonetheless, they're equally producing content, one in a setting which is not as favorable as the other, but reaping benefits very differently. And these are all policy questions that we need to challenge. These are policy questions that are forcing us to think the economic structures around media viability, around how media houses engage platforms, around how we prioritize content coming from the continent, how we prioritize advertising architectures between platforms, media houses, consumers. So there's many questions that we still need to find answers to, and spaces such as the M20 are helping us, or rather provide an opportunity for some of this deeper thinking to occur, which is really what some of these discussions are aiming to do.
Mm. Juliet Nanfuka, please do stay with us. She is a journalist from Uganda who specializes in disinformation. We did mention earlier on that we will be joined by another colleague. We're joined now by President of Kenyan Editors Guild, Zubeidah Kananu. A very good evening to you, Zubeidah. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the conversation. We've already covered quite a bit. We've spoken about the economic aspects of things. We've spoken about the social, cultural and political context or some of these challenges that journalists face, not only in Uganda but in the region. But I'd like to hear your perspective on not only the summit today, its importance, but the unique challenges faced by Kenyan journalists.
Oh, thank you so much for hosting me tonight. Sorry, I joined a bit late. We had a dinner after the first day of the summit. But I'm happy to be here.
I hope we fed you well. Let's just say that out.
Oh, let me tell you, I don't want to go back to Kenya. Can I stay in South Africa? At least for Kenyans, we don't need visas to come to South Africa. So I think I feel at home away from home. So this is an amazing place. I enjoyed myself. And I look forward to tomorrow's session. And as you rightly mentioned, it hasn't been easy for us as female journalists in Kenya. For example, a victim. I've been targeted online several times because the harassment that we face as female journalists has changed its form. So right now we're being targeted online to try to silence us. And I was sharing earlier about this day during the protests in Kenya, and I was in the newsroom getting ready for a bulletin, and I started receiving calls from nowhere, thousands of calls, and I was wondering what was happening because every minute I would pick that call, it kept dropping. So I didn't know what was happening, and then I started receiving texts from strangers, and one of them said that, "Oh, hi, we are saying hi because we saw your number online," meaning our contacts had been shared online by I don't know who. So, and the reason behind it was to silence us, because we had become very uncomfortable to some individuals who didn't want us to continue talking about or calling out the government on certain issues. Because, for example, I would say that I was being targeted because I called out the government on the state of safety and security of journalists in Kenya. I remember it was at that time when one of our colleagues was shot at 3 times at close range by the police. It was very heartbreaking. So we were calling out the government, we were calling out the police regarding what was happening in Kenya at that time, when we were like, this is a journalist who was branded. Everybody could tell that she was a journalist. So why was she shot at the police? She was not armed. The only thing that she had was a notebook and a pen. So why would police officers who were captured on camera, they were in a police vehicle that was not branded, it didn't have a number plate. So we were wondering, why would you target journalists? And she was just one of the many cases that were reported to us through the Kenya Editors Guild. At that time, we had more than 20 journalists who had been injured by the police, who were shot at, others were injured when the police targeted them using tear gas canisters during the protest. And it has been the case the last 2 years. So we felt it got to a point where we needed to call them out. And last year, I called for nationwide protest through my colleagues, through the Kenya Media Sector Working Group, because we felt enough was enough. So I think they shared our numbers online to silence us, because it has been the norm. Every time you become so vocal, they share your numbers because they hope the keyboard warriors online will silence you. And, one thing that they've been keen on, particularly when targeting female journalists, is to bring in your family. So they start talking about your kids, they start talking about your spouses and so on, because that they feel that gets right into you. So, but we stood tall and said that we will not be cowed. I, for example, said it doesn't matter, because when I chose to be a leader, I knew what comes with it. So I chose to take a bullet for the industry, and honestly, it hasn't been easy.
Let me
It
come
hasn't
in
been
right
easy.
there, because we spoke to a journalist, a Palestinian journalist, last week about the dangers faced by journalists trying to cover what's happening in Gaza. And we were just speaking with Juliet now, the role of state actors, particularly in spreading negative portrayals of the media. So I just want to talk about the legal framework that exists in Kenya. So many other countries have said, legally it's there in the constitution, but in terms of the implementation, it's almost like it's at the whim of whatever state leaders are in place, and perhaps what they have to lose. We saw the horrific scenes during those protests, and people being attacked, journalists and civilians being shot at point blank. What is the current government, saying about these incidents? Because we saw media and internet shutdowns as a result of those scenes.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, honestly, because the constitution is in black and white. It's very clear, like everybody knows where to draw the line. Like in the Kenyan constitution, for example, it's only the media that is recognized under the Bill of Rights. Under Article 33, 34, and 35 of the Kenyan constitution, it's very clear. Like we have the freedom of expression, freedom of media, and freedom of expression and access to information. Like it's very clear, everybody knows that media has very many rights that are guaranteed under the Kenyan constitution, but they violate them. They violate them because they feel like there's nothing we can do about it. Because even during the last protest in July in Kenya, they literally walked to our masts and switched us off while we were on air. And they said that we were not allowed to broadcast the protest live. They literally switched us off. And I called them out, honestly. I was in studio for about 8 hours. And I was like, why would you go to our transmitters and switch us off? We have freedom, editorial independence. And the constitution under the Article 34A and B says that there shouldn't be state interference. It's very clear. They know that it's not constitutional for them to do that. And the same thing happened. And we went to court in 2023 and 2024. And the court ruling was very clear that the state should not interfere with press freedom. And the constitution is clear. And they were told that switching off media or threatening to switch off media was against the constitution. But they keep doing it. And I'll come to the issue of advertising as well, because we've gone to court. We went to court last year because it got to a point where, media sustainability has been a challenge, because media depends on government advertising to sustain itself, to run and pay the bills. So last year, there were 2 directives that were issued by the Ministry of ICT and DE in Kenya. whereby they directed advertising to two specific media houses. Print was to go to one media house, and then broadcast advertising was to go to another media house. And we went to court and said they're supposed to be an equal share of the cake. So why are you leaving out the private media in Kenya? Because the law is clear about government advertising, but nobody wanted to hear any of it. So we went to court and we won the case. And this year they issued another advertising. What they're doing is trying to gag media, trying to use different means to ensure that they silence media, that there's no freedom of expression, there's no press, free press in Kenya, there's no editorial independence in Kenya. So what we've been doing is going to court.
Okay, so just hold a thought there, because I want to bring Juliet back into the conversation.
Yeah.
Juliet, you spoke about the World Press Freedom Index earlier on, and I'm just thinking from what Zubeidah is speaking about. We often look at the responsibility that journalists carry in terms of marginalized communities, but it seems like more and more journalists are themselves becoming that. And I want to talk about these incidents. So AI has been used to manipulate what the media themselves go through as part of the disinformation tactics. So I'm just thinking, is the responsibility perhaps also shifting, and are people recognizing that the need for fact checking about what is being said about the media to prevent them from participating in these attacks on the media? And are we too far away from that conversation, or should we start having that conversation?
Great question. It's a conversation that we need to have a whole lot more. Who defends the media when they're under attack? Does the media defend the media when they're under attack? Zubeidah mentioned being targeted for being vocal. Did the media come to her defense? Did media beyond Kenya come to defense? So we need to be asking ourselves these questions as media practitioners, but also as consumers of media. What role do we play in defending the media? What role do we play in checking the information that the media is putting out there? We are living in a time where some media are more likely to tell questionable truths, but do we ask the questions? Do we go to verify the content that we read? Do we read one story and take that as fact? Granted, the media houses are working on establishing or positioning themselves as truth in an age of disinformation. However, there are cases of misinformation finding its way into some of the media content. But that's where fact checkers are coming to play a whole lot more of a bigger role. How do we ensure that cases of disinformation are reported as such and factual information is put out there? We see a lot of mistruths gaining more traction than the pushback, which is often factual. Fortunately, it seems that factual information sometimes just does not have the flavor that some audiences want to take.
Juliet,
yes?
Let me just go back to Zubeidah on this, because you said a very important thing, that even us, the media, what role do we play in protecting other journalists? And I want to understand what the landscape is like in Kenya. And you can also answer afterwards, Juliet, because the playing field is different in terms of country context. I mean, I look at a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's a huge number of politicians who actually own media platforms and stations. So tell us, Zubeidah, in terms of Kenya, media ownership, what role does it play in addressing these problems? And I'm talking here about shared standards of information integrity, particularly the application of regulation of media ethics.
And you bring something quite interesting that I had I had this conversation with colleagues from SABC earlier during an interview, because it reminded me of one cabinet secretary back in the country who went to social media and stated that one particular media house is a brothel. He said that journalists that work there are prostitutes, and he posted that on social media. And when the president was interviewed a few days later on the same, like why he didn't call out that cabinet secretary over his remarks, he says, "Who will protect us from the media? Who will protect the government from the media?" It's like he was endorsing, he was agreeing to what the cabinet secretary had done. And when I had this conversation earlier with the colleagues from SABC, I told them sometimes I feel like as journalists, we fail because we hardly speak for ourselves. And if we don't, nobody will. Because journalism feels like a very lonely profession where I think people feel like we are superheroes, that whatever happens to us, nobody seems to care. Nobody speaks for us. And I told them if it was a doctor who had gone on strike because they hadn't received their pay, in a bulletin, we'll have like 9, 10 stories around that issue of doctors' pay. What about the journalists who have gone for months? Like back home, I've seen journalists go for months without pay. They cannot pay bills. They cannot even eat. Someone comes and tells you, please give me like $1 to go and feed my children. But who is telling our story? And honestly, that's where I feel like as journalists, we fail. We hardly speak for ourselves. We hardly tell our story. And that's why people take advantage of us, because they assume, these people are okay. We shouldn't advocate for them. We shouldn't speak for them. We shouldn't do this and that. At the end of the day, I always tell people, we are human beings. When I leave that newsroom, I'll go home and my kids expect me to pay bills. When they ask for food, they expect me to pay. They don't care whether I have money or not. So we just need to sit back and remember we have a life outside that newsroom. And when things are not right, we need to come out and speak in one voice and speak for us. Because if we don't, honestly, nobody will speak for us. And I've looked at several instances where journalists have been harassed, where journalists have been injured. We'll just cover that one story and we forget about it. So if we don't tell our story, if we don't come up together and stand with each other and defend each other, nobody will do it for us. Because honestly, as a journalist, I've been in this industry for about 18 years. I feel that is where we fail. In as much as we dedicate time, energy, resources to cover other people's stories, we should do the same for us. Because if we don't do it, nobody will speak for us, and we will continue suffering day in, day out.
Zubeidah, I need to wrap up with Juliet and point the same question to you, but ask what the future outlook looks like, what we can do regionally in the face of growing distrust, polarization because of the advent of AI and digitization. Because the lines have also become blurred from citizen journalist to influencer to actual, mainstream media journalistic work. The importance thereof, but also ensuring that there is synergy in information integrity, which itself is a human right.
Great. Information integrity has to remain top of our priorities. As a media fraternity, as content creators, influencers, there's a lot of clickbait information going around. But now more than ever, there is a need to maintain information integrity. But there's also a need to perhaps do things differently. The tools of the profession have changed. The consumers' behavior, the audience's behavior has changed as well. So we need to practice a bit more agility in how we respond to the current times and perhaps the future as well. So that means perhaps better collaborations between journalists and news houses across borders.
Okay.
When there's a
Juliet,
shutdown in one.
I'm going to cut you because I believe the Zoom meeting is going to cut us off because we have gone beyond our allotted time. But I thank you both. Very interesting, edifying conversation on which could go on forever. Thank you to my guests, President of the Kenyan Editors Guild, Zubeidah Kananu, and Juliet Nanfuka, a journalist from Uganda who specializes in disinformation.
Thank you for your time.
Channel Africa, where every moment is an African celebration. Feel the energy, feel the connection. Channel Africa, the African perspective.